Some of the hardest problems in the world exist far above the planet. Our job? To launch the smartest solutions, to protect our satellites, clean up our clutter, to propel breakthroughs in propulsion, to learn more about our place in the universe, to outpace emerging threats. Every day, the Aerospace Corporation uses the latest technologies to ensure our nation's safety and leadership in space.
Welcome to the Space Policy Show. Today we've got Sam Wilson and Frank Rose from Brookings Institution to talk about Japan's gradual shift towards space security. We've also got my co-host Corbin Dallas here in case you can't see him. So really quick, you have two ways that you can ask questions. The first is to go to Twitter, hashtag your questions, hashtag the Space Policy Show, or comment in the video comment box on Vimeo. And we will have our experts engage with you and answer your questions. Now over to Jamie Morin for an intro.
Well, hello, everyone. It's Jamie Morin. I'm proud to be with the Center for Space Policy and Strategy, and I'm delighted to be here to at least virtually introduce a paper that the Center's publishing today on Japan's gradual shift towards space security. For us, this is an extremely important topic. The United States-Japan alliance has served as a cornerstone of U.S. policy in East Asia for decades. The threat environment in the region makes the alliance even more important today. And we think that's particularly true in the area of space, a space domain that's going to face serious challenges in decades to come, including a dramatic jump in the scale of activity in space. When it comes to the space domain, Japan is a great ally to have for the United States. It's among the most mature spacefaring nations in the world, something that's reflected in its budget for space. It's reflected in the number of satellites that it has on orbit, and it's reflected in the types of capabilities it's developed, and also the things that it's looking to develop in the years to come. Most recently, Japan's made headlines with defense space activity, and earlier this year announced they would be developing their own military unit dedicated to space. So this is a timely paper, and we're rolling it out today to really offer insight into the direction and the trajectory of Japan's defense space efforts. We're trying to explore the history of that country's shift toward a space security concept, and also some current policy debates in Japan about the nature of its military space capabilities. The reality for the United States is that we receive enormous advantages from having a network of allies. That network of allies is unparalleled, and it's crucial. In an increasingly competitive environment, we should continue thinking hard about how we can increase how we benefit from those relationships and improve outcomes for both the United States and our allies. As the paper we're releasing today says, it's good to have friends, and the better we know them, the better we can partner with them. So to that end, I'd like to introduce our speakers for the day. We have Frank Rose, Sam Wilson, and Rebecca Rose. And they're going to go into the topics in a little bit more detail. My old friend Frank Rose is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. Prior to that, he served in distinguished roles in government, including as the Assistant Secretary of State for Arms Control Verification and Compliance. He left that role in 2017. Sam Wilson is with Aerospace's Center for Space Policy and Strategy. He's the lead author for the paper, and for the bulk of his work with the center, he's addressed international space issues. He was the lead author for a paper we published last year assessing the impact of the British exit from the European Union on the UK space sector. Rebecca Rose is our moderator. You've already seen her. She is with the corporate communications team at Aerospace and has been our host for all of our space policy shows during the quarantine and isolation period. We hope all of the viewers enjoy today's conversation and the paper, and we really look forward to getting your thoughts both live and after the fact. Thanks for joining us today.
So let me ask the first question. Why Japan? Why is Japan's national security and space activity so important? And I'm going to ask this to both of you, but let's start with Frank first.
Well, I would say the following. Japan is one of the few U.S. allies in the Asia Pacific region who have both capability and capacity. What I mean by that is they have cutting edge weapon systems and they have large numbers of capabilities. Other allies in the region, like Australia, have capability, but they don't necessarily have the capacity. So that's number one. Number two, we in the United States face a major challenge from China. China is competing with the United States across a host of domains, specifically outer space. And indeed, I just wrote a paper that was published earlier this week about China's rise in outer space and what the United States could do to manage that rise. And one of my key conclusions in that paper is America's asymmetric advantage in this competition with China, especially in the strategic domains like space, is its network of allies and partnerships around the world. And I would argue that among our partners, Japan probably has some of the best space capabilities, and those capabilities are improving. Therefore, I think that is why Japan is so important. Thanks.
Thank you, Frank. Sam, what's your take on that?
Yeah, I don't have much to add. I completely agree with Frank. I would just add to a couple points that Jamie said. I mean, obviously, Japan is an extremely important ally. The U.S. has more military forces in Japan than in any other country. Japan sits in a critical region, as Frank said. And then specific to space, Jamie mentioned that Japan is one of the most mature spacefaring nations in the world. It ranks in the top 5 nations in terms of the number of satellites it has in orbit, in terms of its budget dedicated to space. It's one of 5 countries that has its own position navigation timing satellites. So the potential that Japan could bring to more heightened, more extensive military space collaboration with the United States, I think is really attractive. And for that reason, I think it's imperative that we, the United States, have a good sense of the direction of Japan's military space activity. And that's the purpose of this paper. I would also just note that I found Japan's story, Japan's progression towards military space activity really compelling in and of itself. I thought it was a really unique story. And I hope, Rebecca, that you found the same with you, Frank, as well as the millions of viewers that are watching this and that are at home and are reading the paper now and printing it out and showing it to their family and so on. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Sam. So, Sam, you make a historical argument in your paper about Japan's defense space activity. Why so much attention on the country's history? Perhaps you could discuss your argument in more detail. And after Sam speaks, Frank, I'd also like to get your perspective on this. So go ahead,
Yeah.
Sam.
Yeah. Good question. You're right. The paper contains a lot of history. However, to me, it's not history for history's sake. I don't see this as an academic paper. I actually see this as a pragmatic paper. I just think if you're trying to project where you think Japan's military space activity is going to go in the future, you have to have a good sense of how Japan got to where it is. As far as my argument, I take aim at what I call the conventional wisdom, which is this argument that you frequently hear that Japan is in a state of rapid space militarization. And the advocates of the conventional wisdom usually premise their argument on two facts. One is that for 40 years, Japan excluded military space activity. In 1969, Japan passed what is called the Peaceful Purposes Resolution, which said that Japan's space activity was to remain non-military, and that its space engagements would be exclusively for peaceful purposes. This stayed in effect until 2008, when Japan passed what is called the Basic Space Law. The Basic Space Law changed that policy, opened the door for more military space engagement. Because of that Basic Space Law, Japan's military could own and operate satellites. So that's one fact that I think the advocates of the conventional wisdom point to. The other is that Japan has this really impressive suite of capabilities now in terms of space security and defense space. And that's true. I mentioned Japan is one of 5 countries that has its own navigation satellites called the Quasi-Zenith Satellite System, QZSS is how it's commonly referred to. It has its own reconnaissance satellites, the intelligence gathering satellites. It's developing its own deep space radar that will observe objects in geosynchronous orbit. And it's also developing a protected satellite communication system. It already has 2 satellites in orbit, and so that system will be operational in the years to come. So, the proponents of the conventional wisdom say, look, for 40 years, Japan had nothing. Now they have so much. Clearly, they're in a state of rapid space militarization. And if you ask them, well, why 2008, they have a very good answer. They say, Japan was responding to sort of acute security threats that emerged in the preceding years. In 2006, for example, North Korea fired a half-dozen ballistic missiles into the Sea of Japan. In 2007, China conducted an ASAT test in which it blew up a defunct weather satellite. That ASAT test is infamous because it created a lot of debris in low Earth orbit, much of which still remains. But it was also a signal to Japan and the rest of the world that space assets could be held at risk. So the advocates would say, look, because of these these really scary events, Japanese leadership radically transformed their philosophy regarding space and passed the Basic Space Law, which ushered in this era of military space activity that we see actualized in a lot of the capabilities today. Mm-hmm. So my take is, I think that argument is compelling, but I think it's flawed because it misses a lot of the nuance in the buildup to 2008. The 2008 Basic Space Law wasn't this on switch for military space engagement. It wasn't the opening of the floodgates of space security activity. In the years before then, Japanese leadership had actually been making a series of decisions that had kind of paved the way for the space capabilities that you see today. I'll just point out 2 events in this historical trajectory. In the mid-1980s, Japan's government started acquiring satellite imagery from French and U.S. satellites for its military. The government defended its military's use of satellite imagery as being consistent with the 1969 resolution because they pointed to the fact that this was from imagery from commercial or civilian satellites. Therefore, this is technology that's readily available. Its military is not using anything that's more sophisticated than what's readily available. Therefore, it seems appropriate for our military to use it. So that was a big first step in kind of the softening between the lines of what constitutes non-military space activity and what constitutes military space activity. And the second step that I'll point out was in 1998 when Japan made the decision to acquire its own reconnaissance satellites, the intelligence gathering satellites that I mentioned. Japan's government again said that this was consistent with the 1969 resolution, and they pointed to basically 2 reasons. One, similar to the 1980s, the satellites that they were developing was using technology that was no more sophisticated than what existed in commercial and civilian satellites. Therefore, it was based on technology that was readily available. And then second, the satellites would not be owned and operated by its military. In fact, the same month that Japan launched its first reconnaissance satellites in March 2003, they set up a new office to oversee the program. So regardless, this was the first time Japan had acquired satellites that had a direct military application. So this was a big step towards space security. And then if you now fast forward to 2008, by the time they passed the Basic Space Law, Japan already had a 4-satellite constellation of intelligence satellites, and it also laid a lot of the groundwork for its position, navigation, timing satellites. Although the QZSS satellites, the first, wouldn't be launched until after the passage of the Basic Space Law, a lot of the planning and funding took place before. So why does this matter? Is this just a historical squabble? My point is that, if you think that Japanese space security activity went from 0 to 100 in a really compressed time frame, which I think is the argument of conventional wisdom, then it's harder to predict where you think its military space activity is going to go in the future, right? Are they going to stay on this unbelievable momentum moving forward? Is this momentum going to diminish? Or, at the other extreme, something that starts suddenly, could it end suddenly? Well, what are the swings, right? If this really did start in 2008 out of nothing, what's to say that it's not going to stop in another decade from now, right? So, however, if you take my position, that it's not, this immediate upshot, but it's actually been this very gradual, incremental, measured approach, this measured shift towards space security that's basically been in effect for nearly 4 decades, then it's easier to predict where you think Japan's military space activity is going to go in the future, right? It's likely going to stay on this trajectory, or at least something close to it. So that's why I think this matters.
Great, thank you. Frank, did you have anything you wanted to add to that perspective?
Well, what I would say is I think Sam is right. We didn't just have a big poof in 2008 in Japan's space capabilities all of a sudden emerge. This has been a constant and consistent move going back to I would argue, to the late 60s, early 70s. I mean, Japan is a very advanced space country. But where I do break a little bit from Sam is the issue of China. I think the Chinese ASAT test in 2007, which Sam mentioned, was a real wake-up call for the Japanese. And they began to see that their space assets were under threat by China. And I think the Japanese rightly understand that they are not powerful enough to deal with China on their own. They require the support and assistance from the United States to deal with the China challenge. And it's really about this time, 2009, 2010, that you start to see real collaboration between the United States and Japan on space security issues. For example, in 2010, we established the first formal space security dialogue within the context of the alliance called the U.S.-Japan Space Security Dialogue, which I co-chaired in my capacity as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State at the time. We saw the inclusion of space security in the 2015 bilateral security cooperation guidelines. Furthermore, and Sam touches on this in the paper, the Japanese have taken a somewhat different approach to space security than the Europeans. If you go back to the late 1990s, one of the driving factors behind the Galileo program, it's the, for those of you who don't know Galileo, it's the equivalent, the European equivalent to the US Global Positioning System. And one of the real drivers behind Galileo was European strategic autonomy. So they wouldn't necessarily have to be dependent on US GPS. Now, you've got to look at QZSS, which Sam mentioned. QZSS provides the Japanese capabilities, but it's not designed to be, I would say, autonomous of the US GPS system, but to work with and complementary. So I think it's really important if you go back to 2008 and you start to look at the change, it's in many ways the role China and the impact that has on the US-Japan security cooperation. Because my view is that the Japanese view the US-Japan security alliance as critical to their security, especially to push back against China. And therefore, to make the alliance relevant, you need to start dealing with these emerging domains, and space security is one of those emerging domains. I'd also add cyber to that. And in the 2015 guidelines that were agreed to by the US and Japan, both space and cyber play a very important role in those guidelines. And I think that's, again, part of the Japanese desire to make sure that the alliance is evolving sufficiently to deal with the emerging threat. So let me stop there.
Thank you so much, Frank. So the paper brings up 3 current debates in Japanese space policy circles on its defense space activity, each of which I want to ask about. So the first covers the role of JAXA, which is Japan's equivalent of NASA, in space security space engagements. Why is JAXA involved in military activity, and what is the debate about? Sam, I'd like to start with you and then jump to Frank.
Good question, Rebecca. So this issue of JAXA's cooperation with Japan's military kept coming up in my interviews. I should note, for the paper I interviewed, it was largely a literature review, but I interviewed former and current officials in the Japanese space agencies, JAXA, the Cabinet Office, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of Defense, plus Japanese space industry, academia, think tanks, and the U.S. government. So, there's a little bit of sensitivity around JAXA engaging more with Japan's military, partly because JAXA has historically been always focused on civil space efforts and scientific exploration. However, I have to say in my interviews, there was a broad understanding, a broad agreement that in the near term, JAXA would need to engage with Japan's military, and that's because Japan's ministry more and more significant responsibilities for space, but it doesn't have the expertise and the history in space. Some of the folks I spoke with said that there is as few as 10 space experts in the Ministry of Defense. Some that I spoke with said there are as many as 50. Regardless, everyone agreed that there's an insufficient number given what the Ministry of Defense is being tasked to do. JAXA, though, is Japan's preeminent space agency. This is where Japan's space expertise resides, right? So it seems almost necessary for JAXA to play more with Ministry of Defense in this regard. I'll bring up space situational awareness as an example. I mentioned that Japan is developing this deep space radar that'll observe objects in geosynchronous orbit. This is under the Ministry of Defense, and the Ministry of Defense will also likely be responsible for Japan's broader space situational awareness system. That system will include objectives like observing objects, developing a catalog of objects in space, conducting analysis, warning operators of potential risks or collisions. This is a big undertaking. This is super challenging, especially for a ministry that doesn't have any experience in space situational awareness. JAXA, on the other hand, does. JAXA has been operating its civilian-oriented space situational awareness system for some time. That includes a radar, optical telescope facilities. So there was this broad understanding in the interviews that I had that JAXA would need to kind of would need to really assist Ministry of Defense in this effort. I would say a lot of the debate I discovered was more future focused. Whether JAXA's more extensive collaboration with the Ministry of Defense, is this permanent? Is this temporary? Once the Ministry of Defense has its own cadre of space experts, will JAXA need to continue still playing this role? Will at some point the portion of JAXA that's working on space security, could they perhaps at one point break off from the agency? These were questions and insights that some of the experts I interviewed suggested, but again, I think that there's a lot of agreement on kind of the path forward in the near term.
Great, thank you, Sam. What do you think, Frank?
Well, I generally agree with Sam. There was initially a lot of resistance from certain elements within JAXA from playing a role in security. But I think one of the most important signals to be sent was the appointment of Yamagawa-san, the new director of JAXA. He served on a very important space advisory committee that advised Prime Minister Abe on the future of Japan's activities in outer space. And one of the real focuses in key recommendations from that advisory commission was the need for Japan to put more emphasis on space security. And he was an influential member of that committee. So I think Sam is right. One of the questions will be, what's the future role of JAXA in space security? My gut tells me, given one, that they have traditionally had most of the resources and personnel who worked outer space, and the Ministry of Defense is just standing up, it is going to take some real time to build a cadre of experts within the Ministry of Defense. So we'll have to see. I think when it all comes down to it in the end, it's going to depend on budget and resources. But my gut tells me, based on people that I still keep in touch with in the Japanese government, is that JAXA will continue to play a role in space security for some time. But I would note, and Sam brought this up, when you look at the future of space security, these walls between national security space and civil space, they're becoming increasingly blurred. For example, SSA, Space Situational Awareness. It is both a security issue, but it's also key to being able to deal with challenges like orbital debris mitigation. So if anything, and you're seeing this here in the United States as well, that wall between civil space and national security space is shrinking. I think the key challenge Japan will need to focus on is finding a way to do integration between JAXA and the military. And these are issues that we're working out here in the United States, whether it be space situational awareness. The Trump administration wants to transfer the SSA, or Space Traffic Management Mission, to a civilian agency. But it's because the civilian agencies here in the United States don't have the capability. It's the military the U.S. Department of Defense is going to continue to have to play an important role. The key question is making sure we have mechanisms here in the United States to ensure proper integration and coordination. And that's the challenge that Japan is going to have to work out as well.
Great, thank you. Okay, so now the second debate discussed in this paper focuses on the US-Japan relationship when it comes to Japan's decisions over its military space. Frank, going back to your expertise at the State Department, how integral is the United States to Japan's decision-making over its defense space policy decisions?
It is critical. As I mentioned previously, when Japan has purchased military capabilities, whether it be space, missile defense, fighter aircraft, the key principle that they pursue is interoperability with U.S. forces. Yes, industrial development is key. One of the things that you'll see with the Japanese is they tend to buy American, but especially with their fighter planes, but they produce them in Japan. Maintaining that industrial know-how is key for them. However, interoperability with U.S. forces is their number one priority, because the Japanese recognize, especially now, that they cannot deal with China on their own. They need to have an effective system in which the alliance is developing interoperable capabilities to deter and defeat potential threats. And if you look over at the documents that Japan has developed over the past decade that focus on interoperability, especially in the strategic domains, space, cyber, air, missile defense, that interoperability is key. And as I mentioned earlier, with regards to the QZSS satellite system, the objective behind that system is not to replace GPS. It is about ensuring interoperability and complementarity with GPS. So I think viewers need to understand that when Japan thinks about defense decisions, their guiding principle is interoperability with U.S. forces. And I think that will continue to grow.
Thank you. Sam, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, that was really well put by Frank. The initial argument that I was trying to tease out in my interviews was, what is the primary objective of Japan's military space capabilities? Is it, on the one hand, to develop independent systems, or is it, on the other hand, to develop complementary systems to what the U.S. has, to enhance allied capability? And if you look at Japan's most recent strategic guidance, they emphasize both, right? Independent systems and complementary capabilities. And when I brought this up in the interviews, the experts said, this is still a really central debate in Japan. And using space situational awareness as an example again, the experts pointed to the fact that when Japan was making the decision to invest in this deep space radar, the space situational awareness system, there were some in Japan that wanted instead, in lieu of that investment, to invest more in a missile warning capability, a missile detection capability. And their argument was, this is critical. And the argument for the space situational awareness capability was, right, that is critical, but the U.S. already has that capability. If we develop this deep space radar, this might be able to add value. This might be able to, to enhance what exists already in the space surveillance network. This, again, may be able to enhance what currently exists. And so you can see how, this tension, right? Like if you prioritizing independent systems or complementary capabilities, it could drive you to different investment outcomes. So a question that I asked was, okay, well, if there is all this interest in Japan and in independent systems, what does that say about how Japan views the U.S.? Is that a sign that Japan, wants to move away from the U.S.? Is this a sign that Japan wants more foreign policy autonomy? And the answer I got was no, and precisely for the reason that Frank pointed out. Japan's military space capabilities. Yasu Fukushima from the National Institute of Defense Studies said something almost exactly what Frank said. He said, Japan's space security activities are premised on cooperation with the U.S. And I think what was really crucial that they pointed out was even when Japan's developing independent systems, they're still trying to design them such that they're interoperable with U.S. capabilities, that they're providing needed redundancy to U.S. capabilities. So I completely agree with Frank. I think that all this all this means is that there's going to be more growth in partnership in military space partnerships between the U.S. and Japan.
And Rebecca, can I just add on to what Sam said? I don't want to downplay how important it is for Japan to develop industrial capability. That is critical for the Japanese. Again, if you look at their history over the last 40 or 50 years, they could very easily have just bought American systems off the shelf. But in some cases they have, but in most cases, the focus has been on making sure that Japan has the ability to indigenously create military capabilities. But as Sam said, those indigenously developed military capabilities have a requirement to be fully interoperable with U.S. systems to the greatest extent possible.
Great. Thank you both. So this is going to be our last question. We're going to cover the third debate, which discusses counterspace systems, which is really interesting because, as the paper notes, Prime Minister Abe is trying to revise Article 9 of Japan's constitution, which precludes the threat or use of force. What do you think this debate is about, and how would a significant revision to this constitution be? Let's start with Sam, and then we'll switch over to Frank.
Yeah. Really great question. So the Japan's a recent strategic defense document from Japan, the 2018 National Defense Program Guidelines, says something really interesting. It says to ensure superiority in space, Japan's going to develop the capability to interrupt opponents' command, control, communications, and information. So this is the first time in a Japanese strategic defense document that they've called out the need for counter space capabilities. I asked the experts, what specifically this was in reference to, and they said that Japan is considering acquiring moderate jamming capabilities. So then I think pulling on the thread that you just introduced, Rebecca, if given that there's this push by Prime Minister Abe to revise Japan's pacifist constitution, and now that Japan has introduced the need for counter space capabilities, I asked, okay, well, would the revision of Article 9, would the revision of Japan's pacifist constitution, would this lead to Japan pursuing more aggressive counter space capabilities, including like orbital weapons or something kinetic, right? And the answer I got was no. It was a resounding no. It was, look, even if we revise Article 9, that may change our architecture of defense satellite communication systems. Maybe that expands, but there's just no appetite, no interest. No one's arguing for more aggressive counter space capabilities. And again, I would just point this out to what I said earlier. I think all these debates comport with the vision of Japan's very gradual shift towards space security, right? They didn't just start from 0 to 100. This is still going to be a very moderate, gradual shift, and we should all take note of that.
Great. Thank you. Frank, what do you think?
I would agree with Sam on this point. The issue of weaponization of space is a very sensitive issue in Japan, as is the use of military forces overall. I think Sam is right. Whatever Japan eventually does in the counter space arena, whether it be jammers or potentially in the future some other type of capability, will be slow, modulated, and done within the context of the US Japan security alliance. Very similar to what they do on extended deterrence. One of the, I think, paradoxes with regards to Japanese security policy is if you look at their overarching security policy, it is very, very anti-nuclear weapons and pro-nuclear disarmament. That's the common story. On the other hand, Japan understands that nuclear weapons and extended nuclear deterrence has been critical to Japan's security over the last 70 years. So they've had to maintain this very, very tense relationship between disarmament and deterrence. And given the emerging threat environment in space, but in East Asia in general, I think Japan will also, as we move forward, have to maintain a very, very, how would I say this, a cautious approach, whereas they appeal to their general view that we shouldn't have weaponization of outer space, but at the same time, working closely with the United States ensures that the alliance has the capabilities to deter potential attacks on U.S. and Japanese capabilities, and should deterrence fail, be able to operate and in a degraded environment. And that is going to be the nuance that they need to achieve. Now, they have done it in the context of the nuclear paradigm, and my guess is they will do it in the context of the space paradigm.
Great. Well, thank you both so much. Are there any final thoughts that either of you want to share with our viewers today, or do you feel like we covered most of the ground?
Well, I would also add, just because we did not speak about it much, is the important role Japan plays in the development of rules of the road and norms of behavior in outer space. Whatever strategy Japan takes with regards to counter space weapons in the future, I think that's going to have to be closely coordinated with diplomatic efforts. And I would say in the past, we've had no better allied partner than Japan on these kind of soft security issues. And I just think when you deal with the threat that we're facing in outer space, there's not simply a military solution to that problem. It needs to be a comprehensive whole of government approach that includes the military, the civil space, but also the diplomatic element.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing that, Frank. Sam, did you have any final parting thoughts you want to share?
No, I just want to thank you, Rebecca, for hosting us, Joseph for producing this, and Frank. You were a really critical asset for the paper. Thank you for coming on and discussing your thoughts. Thanks for your broader leadership on this issue, and thanks to the many millions of people that are downloading the paper as we speak. Tweet at us on Tuesday. Tweet at us now.
Great. Thank you. All right. Well, that wraps us up for today. Thank you both for being here. It was so great to have you. Just a reminder, ask questions. We want you to engage with us. Hashtag the Space Policy Show on Twitter. Ask your questions in the Vimeo comment box. We will get back to you. We are switching the format just a little bit. So we're going to be coming out now on Thursdays, so once a week. And we will be cutting our episodes down to about 30 minutes, which we found is the sweet spot based off of some analytics that we've been tracking. We just want to make sure that our audience is getting the most out of watching these episodes. Again, we're here to bring the space community together. So thank you again for tuning in. Our next episode will be The Human Side of Space with Kara Kunzeman, Dr. Angie Buckley, and Chris Lanehart with NASA. So thank you, and until next time.